Hello again, and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. Now we're in class number 4. For these next several videos and classes, we'll talk about the geographical context of much of the area that Jesus' ministry took place in. For example, in this video, we'll be talking about Judea in general, some of the cities and areas there, a little bit of Samaria as well. And then the next video will be about Jerusalem, the city, and then the next video about the area of Galilee. So looking forward to that. I hope that you like pictures because I love pictures. I love the visual aspect of being able to see a place that the Bible talks about. And I love how that helps me bring things more to life, kind of turns the Bible from 2D to 3D and from black and white to color. And also how it helps me put together different stories. Real visually can see how different areas of the story may come together. So we want to start off just by showing a few pictures of areas or towns of Judea and Samaria and comment just a little bit on it and then mention some resources where you can find more if you're interested in deepening your study of this. So beginning in Judea, here's the map that we'll talk about where we're going to be. Largely Judea is down to the southern part of Israel, just west of the Dead Sea. And then in the middle, central Israel, here we have Samaria, and we'll touch just a little bit there. And then in future videos, of course, in Galilee. The latter part of this class number 4, 4B, it talks about Jerusalem right here, which is, of course, the center of Israel in importance. If you look at this in a little bit different way, this is a tribal map. And so you get a little bit of an overlay of the tribal areas that still had importance for hundreds of years after the Israelites arrived in the Promised Land. You'll see occasional references to certain tribes or areas in the Gospels. For example, the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, whose people have seen a great light. Talking about Galilee, you see the Zebulun and Naphtali up here. And so the area of Judah, obviously, is from the tribe of Judah. A little bit of Benjamin as well, just to the north of Jerusalem. And so that's part of the area we're talking about. Then when we discuss Samaria and Sychar and Shechem and those places, it's more up in this old region of Manasseh. Now, if you look at the early part of Jesus' life, of course, he was born in Bethlehem. And as we talk about his birth, we'll look at Bethlehem in depth, so we're not covering that now. But I thought it'd be interesting to research out just a little bit to see if there's any traditions or information about where Jesus might have been with Joseph and Mary as a young baby. In fact, for about the first maybe 2 years of his life or more, until Herod the Great passed away. And I came upon this list, and here's a map of Egypt, and it has these places superimposed on it. This is the order in which they were named. I don't know if all of these places are actually places Jesus went with his parents, or perhaps there's a different order. And again, this is all from tradition. There's nothing in the text. It just says he went to Egypt and eventually came back from Egypt, and it doesn't even give a specific time. But it's interesting just to try to see some of the traditions about it. One of the places that's mentioned in this is the Church of the Saints Sergius and Bacchus. It's a place that's built that has connections with Jesus' time there in Egypt. And so it's one of the spots that you can go and perhaps learn a little bit more about those traditions. Then we go further north. Now we're back in the land of Israel. We're going to go up more toward the middle of Israel into the town that today is called Nablus, but in old times was called Shechem, an important town for Joshua, for example, and other people, part of the northern kingdom, if you're thinking about Old Testament. And we want to go to the town of Sychar, which was one of the earlier places Jesus visited in the Gospel of John, where he had the conversation at the well with the Samaritan woman. So if we're looking at the map, again, we're in the middle of Samaria, this whole general region. You have the city of Samaria here. You have other cities we might recognize, Dothan from the story of Joseph and his brothers. You look today at what is called Nablus, again, Shechem, this whole area right here. You see some mountains as well around there. And then you see the little town of Sychar right here. If you go to pictures, Today, you have Nablus or Shechem in the middle between two mountains, and the mountains are familiar ones from the Old Testament and the New Testament, really. The Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal on the left and on the right here. These were the two mountains on which the tribes of Israel gathered after they came into the Promised Land to read the law again and receive the blessings and the curses. And they kind of split up between the two mountains, and that law was read in that context geographically. And then Shechem, of course, was a lot smaller town when Jacob and his sons went to settle there. Now it's a lot larger. And in the time of Jesus, Sychar, the little village, was right over here on the outskirts of Shechem. So it's a kind of part of that. That's why when the Samaritan woman talks about the Mount Gerizim and how there's a temple that the Samaritans worship at in Mount Gerizim, you can kind of get an idea about where that was in relation to where Jesus and the woman were speaking. So over here again to the west, you have Mount Gerizim there. Now, if you go a little bit more to the mountain, first of all, and you think about that conversation, this is actually the base of a Samaritan temple and the foundation here. According to tradition, and we'll talk more about this later, but Sanballat, one of the figures mentioned in Nehemiah, had a daughter who married one of the priests from Jerusalem. And so that priest came up and he was offered to be the high priest of the new temple that Sanballat was going to build in Samaria. And so he did that. He married the daughter of Sanballat. He became the priest of the temple. And the temple evidently was fairly similar to the temple that was in Jerusalem, which is interesting for us because if that's the case, then we can look at some of the ruins of this temple and wonder about how the temple in Jerusalem might have been during that time as well. And again, you see some of the steps there with that. And then from above, looking down on the valley with the city of Shechem, and it goes on from there. Now, I want to mention to you, again, these videos, the series called Above Israel. There's 4 different DVDs in the set, and there's a video about Mount Gerizim, in fact, several little clips about it from the Samaria and Judea desert area. And so you can look at video number 9 and see that. Now, the reason I'm not showing it to you is because I'm not certain about some of the copyright rules. And so I don't want to infringe on that and disrespect their rights with that video. But I do want to recommend these videos in general. It's a great set to purchase if you can. And I've watched through all the videos, and I personally, again, love it. The visual aspect, how it puts things together from the air, the commentaries on it. And you can obviously look at it, pause anytime you want to study it more in detail, like a picture. Really enjoy them. So I recommend the series, and in particular for this area, the video about Mount Gerizim. Now, if you zoom in just a little bit more on the area of Sychar, again on the outskirts of Nablus today, you see a church that's been built. I believe it's a Greek Orthodox church, and this is the church built over the well of Jacob. Now, this is one of the places where we are pretty much 100% certain that this is where Jesus talked to the woman, because this location in Jacob's well has been tracked ever since it was built, ever since it was dug, because water is so important and so scarce in Israel that you have to maintain all the sources of water that you can. And so they've kept track of this well and where it is. And so we know almost 100% certainty that this is where this miracle happened. So if you go inside the church and you go down some steps kind of underneath the central part of the church, this is actually the well right here. And it was interesting that we were standing with the guide, and he took a little cup, actually filled up part of that bucket this time, and then he poured a little bit of it out, and then he counted, and it took about 4 seconds for the water to hit the water down below in the well. In other words, a very deep well. But this well has been around now for thousands of years, and it's still producing water. And then we took advantage of the opportunity to read the story of Jesus in John 4. My wife there with her phone reading that story about Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Just a special place. You can also, if you want to, get a little bitty jar, clay jar that's painted with some of the water from Jacob's well in it. And as I understand it, you can drink it without fear of getting sick, which is a little bit unusual. Some of the places you won't want to drink the water, but I never saw anyone get sick from drinking this particular water. So interesting place to visit. I recommend it if you can go to central Israel. It's actually inside the West Bank these days, so you have to go through the checkpoints from Israel into the West Bank, but it's well worth the trip, and other areas around there as well. Then we move on a little bit south and east to the town of Jericho. We were up here more in central Israel. Okay, now we move all the way down. See where this little star is down here, and the town of Jericho here. If we zoom in just a little bit more on the map, we actually see that in the time of Jesus, there were two locations of Jericho. One was more of the Herodian Jericho. One was the ancient Jericho. At least two locations for Jericho. And this comes into play in one of the stories in the Gospels of the blind men, because there seems to be a contradiction as to whether Jesus was leaving or coming in to Jericho. And one of the Gospels reports he was leaving, one reports he was coming in when it happened. And actually, if we understand two Jerichos, he could be leaving one and going into the other. So that reconciles the contradiction there. So there's where that's located. If you take an aerial shot from the south, here are some of the important parts of it. Again, there's the ancient Jericho, where we think Joshua and the Israelites captured Jericho way back in the book of Joshua. Then there is Herod's palace, which you see over here, that Herod the Great built, and went there some in the winter when it was colder in Jerusalem. This is a warmer place, an oasis. And then you have modern Jericho that you can visit today with a number of houses and shops and everything. And then this Tel es Sultan here is the Arabic name for the Tel that's thought to be where Joshua conquered Jericho and the walls fell down. So that's one view, a pretty good aerial view to show you all of it. And that's part of the Jordan Valley, which used to be really lush in the time of Lot and Abraham, but now is really a lot more desert, except for this area right around the city with the 12 springs of the oasis there. Now, if you look from a little bit different angle, now we're looking from the south and looking straight north, and you see the things we mentioned before, the Tel es Sultan, Herod's palace, and then a couple of other things. One here, this circle surrounds, you can barely see here, Mount Hermon, a little bit of snow on top of it still. And if you look at a map of Israel, Mount Hermon is on the very northern border of Israel. And then if you look at Jericho, Jericho is almost all the way down to the Dead Sea, at least 2/3 of the way down the modern country of Israel. This shows you really that this land is not that big at all. A lot of stuff happened in a compressed area. And then the other things I notice in this is the Wadi Kilts. It's this little arrow, this little line that you follow. A wadi is kind of like a ravine, a deep ravine, and it's places where sometimes there's roads or paths that people use to cut through the desert, a little bit in the shade. Sometimes there's wells that they can stop at and get water as they walk through the desert. This particular one goes from Jericho all the way up to Jerusalem, and it is probably the place that's referred to in Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan, the man that was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked by robbers. This is likely the path that was used by that man. The other thing is that we know Jesus and many pilgrims came down from Galilee and went back to Galilee for the feasts, and this is one of the routes that they used to come through Jericho, come through the Jordan Valley south, come to Jericho, then cut through this ravine here, this Wadi Kilts, and go up to Jerusalem. So it's likely that Jesus also walked through the Wadi Kilts. So if you can, it's a great thing to go there and to walk that trail from Jericho out to a little parking lot kind of you can get to from Jerusalem. The walk itself through the Wadi is about maybe 3 miles, but very interesting. It's probably about 10,000 years old, that path, and that road has been used. And it's very interesting to walk along. So if you can do that, do that. Then we have here, another picture of the area of Jericho. Again, you're locating the Tel es Sultan of ancient Jericho. Then this area here, the Judean desert, all of this surrounding area. is the area mentioned in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 about the temptations of Jesus. And it says right after he was baptized, then the Spirit took him into the desert to be tempted. And so they've built a monastery right up here on one of the mountains overlooking Jericho and call it the Temptation Monastery, the Monastery of the Temptations. And that's possible, but the thing is, we don't know exactly where the temptations happened. Somewhere in the Judean desert, we know that. So in some ways, it's kind of a convenient location, kind of focuses tourism, things like that. You can take a cable car up to that. There's a restaurant up there, but we obviously don't know exactly where the temptation happened, somewhere in this desert. And then just more of a panoramic view from the southeast, putting together some of the places we've looked at. The new things in this one are the Jordan River out here in the distance, coming through the Jordan Valley. And then also it reaches the Dead Sea, and the Jordan River empties into the Dead Sea and ends, and that's the lowest point on earth right over here. Again, you see more close to you some of the places of Jericho, modern Jericho. Now, this is Jericho seen from a different perspective from the Mount of Temptation that I mentioned to you. A great view, a little bit closer up than the aerial shots we saw, and you see some of the buildings connected to the monastery down here. If we zoom in even more on Jericho, then we go to the Tel Es Sultan, the ancient Jericho, and this is one of the possible locations for the story of the fall of Jericho, literally the falling of the walls. There's some problems with the dating of it. If you go to the date that you think that event happened, that's usually taken as the typical date, anywhere from, say, 1250 to maybe 1400 BC. And if you go down to the strata, the level that the archaeologists have named as, that time period, one of the problems is that there's no evidence of fallen walls or burned walls at that level, that strata, okay? And so you either have the right place in the wrong time or vice versa. And so one of the theories that's proposed by some scholars is that perhaps there's a different location in Jericho in which there's other oases, and that as there were earthquakes in Jericho, that some of the oases, the fountains kind of dried up or were blocked temporarily. And so the people would have to move away from that particular oasis and go and camp around a different oasis in the same area. And so it's possible that this is not the Tel, that it's actually a Tel they found near a different oasis that might be the one where Joshua and the Israelites attacked. So interesting to study. Some things aren't as certain, but the primary value of this is to get an idea of the location of Jericho for the stories that happen there in the New Testament, especially in the ministry of Jesus. Now, I want to stop sharing the PowerPoint for a moment and go to share one of the 360 videos that we made. Let me put that up first. Okay, you should be seeing that. And let's go full screen. And so this is one of the places where we made a 360 video. Just put it on a tripod and just started filming. And again, like we mentioned, you can either play it and hear the commentary on it. And as you hear it, you can move it around. You can grab it with your mouse and hold down and just spin it around. So if you're looking down, for example, you're looking down, several hundred or thousands of years here. Jericho is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, according to what we understand. Some of the ruins go back to 8,000 BC, which is about 10,000 years ago. And from that point to now, there's always been people living here. So if you spin around, you see in the distance the mountains over here that we mentioned before, part of the Judean desert. And on one of these mountains here is the Mount of Temptation, right? Then if you look on down the middle part here, you see how they've kind of cut down, like slicing into a cake. And so the archaeologists can come along and study it layer by layer. They can look at the strata from top down. And as you go down, of course, the older the ruins get. And so they've been able to find out a number of interesting things about this particular Tel. And then if you keep on spinning around, you see part of the top of the Tel, another area they've excavated here. And then you see over here where our group is standing underneath this pavilion. is actually a place overlooking modern Jericho. And so it's interesting to walk around. Whenever I've been there, it's been the summer. It's also really hot, like 105, 110 degrees. So if you go, just be ready for that with plenty of water. But it's interesting to see. So again, we recommend these videos just as good places to go to look at a certain location, and you can stop it or spin it around any way you want to look at while you're reading about it or studying about it. Now let's begin the PowerPoint again. Okay. Now we're going to move a little bit closer to Jerusalem, and we're going to go to the town of Bethany. And one of the first things that you notice about Bethany today is that the Israelis have built a wall. They call it a security wall. They have accused the Palestinians and others of trying to come into Israel, infiltrate, and take more land. The Palestinians have accused the Israelis of going and taking land from the Palestinians and building settlements. And then the Israelis built this wall as well. And so it's a pretty costly wall. It's taken a long time to build. It's provoked a lot of problems, and we'll talk more about it a little bit when we go to study Bethlehem. But this is part of the wall that goes around the West Bank, large part of it near Bethany. Then if you go on into Bethany, you see a pretty typical city for now. You see some towers of mosques scattered around the city. At Bethany also you have some churches. In particular, the Church of Bethany, which is the tomb of Lazarus, the traditional tomb of Lazarus. And if you go to that, you see the signs identifying it as such in Hebrew and in English, of course, there, and also in Arabic. And if you go in that little door underneath the orange sign here, down toward the bottom right here, then you can go on down more steps, and then down at the bottom, you see the tomb where Lazarus was supposedly laid. Now, again, with many places here, I'm going to say supposedly or likely or possibly, because again, I want to be as honest as possible, and we don't know about a number of these places where the exact spot was. Okay, again, we want to give a general idea of what the geographical context was like, what the site was like, or the city was like, and that'll help us understand the story. But in many cases, it's hard to go to a square yard or a certain area of town and say this is the exact spot it happened 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. And so this is one of those places that tradition holds was the tomb of Lazarus in Bethany, where Jesus goes and resurrects him in chapter 11 of John. And it is in Bethany. We know that's never changed. We know where Bethany is. And this is, I think, a good possibility, but we just don't know. Interesting to be there, though. Now, so that concludes our first part of our tour of Judea. Here are some resources that I've mentioned or that I've used during this particular PowerPoint. I want to recommend, again, Logos. I mentioned that in the resources class. This resource that we used in this one was the New Bible Dictionary about many of these places. And then other books, we're going to refer more to the Gerard book and the video about Jerusalem, the Preserving Bible Times with Above Israel videos from the helicopters. Those are great, and then different maps and images as well. So in a lot of these classes, we'll try to provide resources as we go through so that you can go and do your own digging and work on those. Well, I hope that this class has been helpful to you. I hope you like pictures and maps, because there's a lot more coming in the next couple of classes. We'll see you now in the next class on Jerusalem.